No one in the room expected that this ordinary policy discussion would soon become the moment everyone would be talking about. At first glance, everything felt routine. The chamber was quiet, almost predictable. Lawmakers sat in their assigned seats, papers neatly arranged in front of them. Staff members leaned against the walls or sat behind laptops, quietly reviewing notes. Cameras were already rolling, capturing every angle of the hearing room. From the outside, it looked like just another day in politics, another debate, another exchange of viewpoints that would likely end without much attention. But sometimes history doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins in the most ordinary moments. Across the room sat Jasmine Crockett. Her posture was straight, her eyes focused. She wasn't speaking yet. Instead, she was listening, carefully, attentively, almost studying the conversation unfolding around her. On the other side of the room was James Talarico, calm, composed, and confident. He looked comfortable behind the microphone, as if this environment was exactly where he expected to be. Two experienced voices, two very different styles, and soon, two completely different philosophies about leadership. When the moderator signaled for the discussion to begin, Talarico spoke first. His voice was steady and controlled, the kind of voice that doesn't rush or stumble. He laid out his position carefully, almost like someone placing pieces on a chessboard. He talked about responsibility. He talked about leadership. He talked about values. Every sentence sounded deliberate. Each word seemed measured, as though he had thought about it long before stepping into the room. He emphasized that leadership requires balance, that decisions are rarely simple, that governing often means weighing competing priorities. Some lawmakers nodded slightly. Others listened quietly, taking notes. His tone wasn't aggressive. It was thoughtful, almost reflective. For a moment, the room felt calm, predictable. But then the moderator turned toward Crockett. When it was her turn to speak, something unexpected happened. She didn't start talking immediately. Instead, she paused. Not a long pause, just long enough to make people slightly uncomfortable. In debates, silence can be more powerful than words, and in that brief silence, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Crockett leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, controlled. But underneath that calm tone, there was something sharper, something that suggested she wasn't about to deliver a routine response. She didn't start with criticism. She started with a question, a simple question, the kind of question that sounds harmless at first. Can you clarify what you meant by that earlier statement? It seemed straightforward, almost polite. But questions, when used carefully, can be far more powerful than accusations. Talarico answered confidently. He explained his point again, slightly expanding on his earlier remarks. His tone remained steady, thoughtful, and composed. For a moment, the conversation seemed balanced. But Crockett asked another question, then another. Each one sounded simple. Each one seemed fair. But together, they began to form a pattern. Every answer required a little more explanation. Every explanation opened another door. And slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The debate was no longer just about policy. It was becoming something else. Crockett wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't attacking. Instead, she was guiding the conversation. She brought up previous statements, past remarks that Talarico had made publicly, votes that had been recorded, words that had already been spoken. And one by one, she connected those moments together. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical, almost surgical. Staff members in the room began to notice the shift. Some stopped typing for a moment. Others leaned forward slightly, paying closer attention. Talarico continued to defend his position. He spoke about context, about the complexity of policymaking, about how decisions are rarely black and white. His arguments were thoughtful, but Crockett wasn't finished. She listened quietly as he spoke, and when he finished, she asked another question, a question that would slowly begin pushing the debate towards something no one in that room had expected. Because sometimes a debate doesn't explode. Sometimes it tightens, slowly, carefully, until one final moment changes everything. And in that room,
the atmosphere in the chamber was no longer the same.
What had started as a routine policy discussion had quietly transformed into something far more intense. The tone of the room shifted from casual attention to careful observation. Lawmakers who had been casually reviewing notes were now watching closely. Staff members who had been typing on laptops slowed their hands. Even the cameras seemed to linger longer on the faces of the two speakers. At the center of it all sat two people. On one side was Jasmine Crockett, calm but unwavering. On the other side sat James Talarico, composed but now clearly aware that the debate had moved into deeper territory. After confirming that he stood by his earlier words, Talarico leaned slightly toward the microphone again. His voice remained controlled, but there was a noticeable urgency underneath it. Leadership, he said carefully, is not about sound bites. It's about intention. It's about the heart behind the words. The statement was thoughtful, almost philosophical. It was the kind of argument that shifts the conversation away from individual statements and toward broader ideas. For a moment, it seemed like he had successfully redirected the debate. But Crockett wasn't interested in abstraction. She leaned forward again, speaking with the same calm tone she had maintained since the beginning. Intention doesn't erase impact. The sentence was short, direct, and powerful. You could see the reaction ripple quietly across the room. A few lawmakers exchanged quick glances. Someone at the back of the chamber leaned forward slightly. Even the moderator shifted in his seat. Talarico responded quickly, as if he had anticipated that argument. He spoke about context, about how complex issues demand complex answers. He insisted that reducing policy decisions to a single phrase or moment could create a misleading narrative. His tone was passionate now. He spoke about faith. He spoke about community. He spoke about the importance of holding strong beliefs while still respecting the perspectives of others. For a brief moment, his words resonated with some in the room. Heads nodded slightly. The tension eased just enough to suggest that the debate might be returning to familiar political territory. But Crockett had been building toward something else. Instead of questioning his sincerity, she questioned his consistency, and that difference changed everything. She calmly brought the conversation back to specifics. Dates, votes, public statements. Each point was presented slowly and clearly, almost like someone laying out evidence in a courtroom. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't raising her voice. But every new detail required an answer. Every answer required explanation. And explanations take time. Time exposes contradictions. Talarico defended himself carefully. He acknowledged concerns and clarified the context behind several decisions. He explained that leadership often involves growth and learning over time. Changing perspectives, he said, is not hypocrisy, it's maturity. That line landed well. You could feel the room relax slightly. The argument was thoughtful and reasonable. It framed evolution as a strength rather than a weakness. For a moment, it seemed like the pressure had been neutralized. But Crockett responded with a question that shifted the entire narrative again. She didn't challenge the idea that people can grow. Instead, she asked something far more specific. When did that growth happen? The question was simple, but the implication behind it was not. Did the change occur before criticism or after it? Before public pressure or because of it? The timing mattered. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about beliefs anymore. It was about political calculation. Talarico paused. Not for long, but long enough for people to notice. Then he answered thoughtfully. Growth isn't triggered by headlines, he said. It's shaped by listening, by conversations, by experience. He spoke about constituents who challenged him, about real people whose stories had influenced his thinking. His tone sounded sincere and reflective. For a moment, the defense felt powerful. But Crockett wasn't finished building her argument. She leaned slightly closer to the microphone. Growth requires acknowledgement, she said calmly. Then she asked the question that changed the atmosphere in the room again. Was there harm caused by those earlier positions? The words hung in the air, because admitting harm is very different from explaining intention. The room became noticeably quiet. Talarico carefully chose his response. Policies can have unintended consequences, he said slowly. Debates often oversimplify complex outcomes. It was a careful answer, thoughtful, strategic. But he didn't say the word yes, and that missing word echoed louder than anything else. Crockett didn't react emotionally. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate the moment. Instead, she simply repeated the question. Was there harm? This time her voice was softer, almost patient. And that softness made the question even sharper. Talarico shifted strategies again. He brought in the conversation, arguing that no single lawmaker carries sole responsibility for systemic outcomes. Policy decisions, he explained, are made collectively through institutions and legislative processes. It was a familiar political argument. Shared responsibility, shared decision-making. But Crockett brought the conversation right back to individual accountability. Leadership means owning your part. At that moment, the debate stopped sounding like two politicians discussing policy. It sounded like two completely different philosophies colliding. One focused on intention and principles. The other focused on consequences and accountability. Neither side raised their voice. Neither side showed disrespect. But the divide between them had become unmistakable. Then something unexpected happened. Talarico leaned forward and asked Crockett a question. The dynamic of the room flipped instantly. "Do you believe compromise has any place in governance?" he asked. The question caught the room's attention, because now Crockett was the one being challenged. He continued, asking whether holding firm to every position without flexibility actually helps the people leaders claim to serve. The chamber stirred slightly. Now the spotlight had shifted. But Crockett didn't hesitate. "Compromise is powerful," she said calmly. Then she paused briefly, but only when it doesn't compromise people's rights. The sentence landed with quiet force. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it drew a clear line. Talarico responded carefully. He warned against absolute positions, arguing that democracy requires negotiation and cooperation. Rigid lines, he said, can lead to gridlock rather than progress. And that's when the tension rose again. Crockett asked a question that forced the debate into deeper moral territory. Should protecting fundamental rights ever be negotiable? The room fell silent. This wasn't a policy detail anymore. This was philosophy. Talarico answered carefully. "Rights must be balanced against other responsibilities," he said. "That's how governance works." Balanced, the word lingered in the air, and Crockett seized it immediately. Balanced against what? Economic interests? Political pressure? Polling numbers? Each possibility carried heavier implications than the last. The tension in the room became electric, because once you begin ranking rights against competing priorities, you enter dangerous territory. Talarico defended his position, explaining that real-world leadership requires weighing complex factors. But the audience wasn't hearing complexity anymore. They were hearing contrast. Conviction versus compromise. Principle versus calculation. And then Crockett did something no one expected. She returned to the very beginning of the debate, to the original phrase he had agreed to stand by, and she connected it directly to the balancing argument he had just made. Now the contrast was undeniable. If a principle is firm, she implied, how can it also be negotiable? The room didn't erupt. It froze. Because everyone understood what had just happened. The debate had reached a turning point. But the most important moment was still ahead, because how Talarico responded next would determine whether the pressure would break the argument or redefine it completely.
The tension in the room had reached a new height. Every word mattered now. Every glance, every pause, every movement of the hands or tilt of the head carried weight. What had begun as a routine discussion about policies had evolved into a subtle battle over philosophy, principle, and responsibility. Jasmine Crockett remained calm, composed, and unwavering. She had guided the conversation from ordinary policy to an arena where accountability was unavoidable. Her questions, each more pointed than the last, had peeled back layers of political language to expose the very core of leadership, owning one's actions and decisions. James Talarico, on the other hand, was still composed, yet the stakes had shifted. His careful explanations about context, nuance, and the complexity of governance had held for a while, but Crockett's persistence had narrowed the space for abstraction. The conversation was no longer about theory, it was about ownership. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her voice remained calm but firm. If the outcome still causes harm, after all the negotiation, the context, and the intentions, who takes responsibility? The question landed with quiet force. It wasn't aggressive, but it was inescapable. Silence fell over the chamber. Staff members stopped typing. Cameras lingered on the exchange. Every eye in the room was locked on the two lawmakers. For a split second, Talarico hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, but in debates, a fraction of a second can feel like an eternity. His mind raced, balancing principle, political considerations, and the undeniable presence of Crockett's logic. The room waited. Everyone sensed that the next words would define the remainder of the debate. Finally, Talarico responded, choosing each word with care. Leaders must take responsibility when policies fail, not committees, not systems, leaders. The simplicity of his statement contrasted with the complexity of the discussion that had preceded it. The room reacted subtly but unmistakably. Faces softened. Some leaned back, absorbing the clarity that had emerged from the tension. Even the moderator, who had been diligently steering the discussion, paused for a moment, recognizing the gravity of what had just been articulated. Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't press further. Instead, she allowed the answer to resonate, and then calmly she walked the room through the timeline she had built from the start. The original words, the decisions that followed, the tangible impact on real people. Her voice was steady, measured, almost reflective. Her final statement was simple yet profound. If leadership requires responsibility, then that responsibility doesn't disappear when it's uncomfortable. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it carried weight far beyond the immediate words. It crystallized the debate into its essential truth. Leadership is defined by ownership, by integrity, by the courage to face consequences, not rhetoric. For Talarico, this was not a surrender. His tone shifted, less defensive, more grounded. He acknowledged that every vote, every statement, carries weight, and that debates like this are necessary precisely because they force leaders to confront that weight directly. He spoke about the realities of governing, about the delicate balance between principle and practical implementation, and about the human impact of political decisions. The audience, both in the room and later online, could feel the shift. This was no longer about winning a point. It was about clarity, accountability, and the rare demonstration of genuine political integrity. Crockett had achieved something subtle but powerful. She had guided the debate to a place where clarity replaced complexity, and accountability replaced abstract discussion. The room was quiet, but the weight of her words lingered, echoing in the minds of everyone present. Talarico, too, had shown a side rarely visible in heated political exchanges, the willingness to confront the tension between principle and practical governance, to admit the necessity of judgment and compromise, and to accept the weight of responsibility. And the final moment, the one that viewers and analysts would remember for days, wasn't explosive. It wasn't a dramatic gesture or a shouting match. It was the quiet alignment of words and accountability. The instant when both leaders, in their own way, acknowledged that leadership is not about clever phrasing, strategy, or intention alone. It is about ownership. Crockett nodded ever so slightly, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and quiet triumph. She had guided the debate to a rare truth, the moment when responsibility replaces rhetoric. The moderator moved on to the next topic, but the energy in the room had shifted irreversibly. Lawmakers were more attentive. Staffers typed faster, no longer distracted. Cameras lingered, capturing the faces of two politicians who had just redefined what a debate could look like. It was clear, this moment would circulate, replayed over and over, analyzed online, debated and remembered, not for who shouted the loudest, but for who demonstrated clarity, integrity, and accountability. For viewers, this was more than politics. It was a lesson in leadership, a demonstration of how calm persistence, strategic questioning, and unwavering focus can bring even the most composed individuals face to face with their own words, principles, and responsibilities. And as the chamber slowly emptied, and the microphones went silent, the impact lingered, not because of theatrics, not because of spectacle, but because clarity in leadership is rare, and when it happens, it changes everything. This was the moment that transformed a debate into a defining exchange. One question, one answer, one principle. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible shift, the entire debate had been changed forever. Because in politics, arguments are common, but clarity is rare. And once it arrives, nothing is ever the same again.